So my little camera was not in the proper spot when it said smile for a thumbnail and went ahead with its little automatic deal, irreversible, as it turns out. Can't edit it back and make a proper thumbnail with a screenshot. So there you go. Got a picture of a bunch of entrail like wires all over my desk, which is what the camera was pointing at for the thumbnail, which I now think is kind of funny. So there you are. Today, I'll share with you a little conversation from a bit back when my son Eric, having heard some words and thinking about those words and historical stuff in school, or who knows what other references that kid comes across. And he wanted me to explain what is, I can't remember whether it was communism or socialism. And so I said, well, brace yourself. And first, a little speech about how different people are going to have these different meanings for these words and so on. But the first one I said was an idea. And I talked about how it's basically a matter of the ownership of what you make, and that there is no revenue flow upward from production. And so it's an idea that we do not have ownership and control of product, aside from those who actually do the work. And so we talked a little bit about that and how that's different from how things are as we usually encounter them. And I said, this is an idea. And the interesting point is that there are many people who have talked about or thought about or tried to implement the idea in terms of society. But the means by which this occurs and the portrait of what it should be like, either as a process to get there or as an eventual outcome, remain unknown. So it is an idea, and the question is, how does it relate to reality, or how can it be implemented in reality? That is a matter of some concern. All right, so then I contrasted that with socialism, and I dialed it back to say we are not, maybe ism isn't the right word, maybe ist is the right word. It describes aspects, and in this case, it's exactly the opposite. It is a policy, and the policy, involves a variety of different principles of basically distribution of wealth and the provision of services across society in terms of uniform accessibility, uniform quality, perhaps, or somewhat. And anyway, the idea that these are policies, and that if you look at sort of individual policies, you'll see lots and lots and lots of socialist policies all over the world, even in places that specifically say we aren't a socialist country or we don't have socialism. You look and you will see various policies inside it, various practices inside it where the policy of socialism is in place. So, whether schools for roads or what have you. When people talk about socialism as a big noun, the idea is, well, we're going to extend that to everything in the society. But it makes a lot more sense to say socialist is describing a policy that implements those kinds of things. Now, the interesting point is that just as communism is an idea without a whole lot of certainty regarding policy, socialist stuff are policies which engender a great deal of debate about what they mean in terms of ideas. Is it devoid of purpose and idea beyond simply what it does? Or is it to be hitched up to other similar things and implemented more and more and more to achieve more of a unification or a bunch, basically, of permeating society as such with it? Or do you have like a socialist system, period, that's sort of designed, and then you have its pieces and parts according with, some way of articulating it as an idea? But the point is that there isn't such an idea. You can't just reach out and nip one out of, the universal dictionary and say, okay, that's the idea that there's no, we understand what it means as policy, but you see, so I mentioned these as opposites and in these terms. And so anyway, we talked all about all sorts of the things that people spin off of when you bring these up, but I thought I'd share these with you specifically so you could get all your little actualies out, preferably somewhere else besides my comments, but if you must. So go ahead and actually all you want, and I'll decide whether I think you merit anything by it. You're welcome. And so I thought it was sort of an interesting thing for the kid to bring up, and it gave me a chance to get my head together a little bit about, well, how do you explain these terms to someone who's interested? And that leads to a couple of other points that have been brought up to me over the years, particularly about 3+ years ago, in the big questions of certain great big words. I found it useful basically to torch some words. And I always have. There are words which need to be simply torched so that the conversation can occur, because the words don't actually work. One of them is democracy, specifically construed as a noun. Like socialist, it makes a lot more sense if you simply say, all right, well, there is this or that policy or this or that practice, better put, this or that practice, and in a given place, in a given time, in a given nation, whatever, culture, and you say, well, okay, how democratic is it? I mean, and the question there is a matter of votes. And that's that. Just whether votes are involved. Now, what are you voting for? Are you voting for the actual policy, in what you might call a referendum? Or are you voting for somebody to do a particular job? And once in that job, then they have authority over it until such a time as there's another election. Is that how that works? Etc. This is where terms like, republic and stuff like that get involved. So the point being, though, is none of that matters to this in terms of definitions. If practices are in place as social policy, activity is concerned, and votes are involved, then it's democratic. You can talk all about representative democracy, whether it represents all the people who are affected by it, which meant they got to participate in that. That's another variable. It's a dial. It's not part of the definition. And furthermore, there are some fundamental questions that arise upon thinking of, for example, the more consequential forms of democracy, for example, referenda, and situations where a person is, people or representatives are elected to positions and then they wield considerable authority in terms of implementing policies. And so at that point, one says, when looking at those kinds of practices, and you say, well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, why is that any good? What makes that a good policy? I mean, except perhaps in some external sense of being able to look at people when it all goes south and say, see, got yourselves into that. Too bad. It's what you wanted. Because there doesn't seem to be sort of a corollary in the sense that, well, when it doesn't go south for one reason or another, is it because it was a democratic process that put it there? Hard to argue that, really, looked at bluntly. I mean, really? Because it got into place because of that? That means that's why it worked out well? How does that work exactly? And so to demystify the shall we say, sanctity, the virtue of a practice because it's democratic is a really good idea. Instead, to say that it is fraught with risk. It is absolutely, It is absolutely fraught with risk. There are intrinsic things about doing any sorts of important policies this way, whether directly through referenda or indirectly through representatives, and all kinds of things. All sorts of difficulties it's fraught with to turn out really, really, really badly. I mean, like super badly. And we have literature and philosophy and histories that, explicitly say this. I don't recall any other point to the Peloponnesian Wars when I read it, for example. And so you end up with this sort of worry. It's like, well, if we're going to do this, then how do you keep it from going really, really bad? And that lays out a whole bunch of interesting points that I think are worth painful review, because most of the things that, at least in the States, are sold as the ways that it all turns out so well are deeply questionable. Okay, and so you'll notice I haven't even talked about the misapplication, or rather, shall we say, incomplete or poor or abusive implementations of voting processes. Because you see, to say, well, it's bad that these people are having their vote suppressed. That kind of presupposes that having the whole voting system in the first place is super good. I mean, like super great. Well, is it super great? I mean, granted, if it's what we're going to do, and if we're going to say we're going to do it the way so that everybody gets the vote, then you turn around and screw over a substantial portion, or really anyone in the population, from doing so, then that's bad in and of itself. But look out for that hidden message, which is that if everybody got to do it the way we say that everybody's supposed to do it, then then that's ipso facto great, because the thing to do is ipso facto great. And that's what I'm talking about. It seems to me that should one have democratic processes of significance as part of the social system, then certain other things have to get put into place really, really brutally, and I mean savagely, to keep specific abuses from occurring. I'm sitting in a country right now which had, however ambiguously, depending on whom you ask, has taken steps of this sort. And one of those steps is you can't get rich. Not in the sense that most of the world, that especially places like the US or a number of other places, consider really rich. You can. It's that money goes away. It's since governments make their own money, and Sweden does not have some sort of cost balance loan relationship with the World Bank. Basically, it means that when it prints money, the money is made. And so therefore, taxing and then saying, well, we're going to balance the books, this becomes just as much of a fiction here as it does in any other economically sovereign state. That merely keeps people happy for some reason. And the real point is simply to say, once you have over a certain amount of wealth, you can't have it. And that disappears. It doesn't go back in to pay for things in the government. That's not what money does. It evaporates. The rule here in Sweden is you can't be rich. And the reason you can't is because it means you start screwing up the democracy. If you're going to have all this democracy stuff and then some people can get really rich, okay, that's a deal breaker. It screws it all up. It's gone. And that's just one example. There are quite a few others, as my mention of the Peloponnesian Wars and war fever and overstretch and a variety of other interesting phenomena that seem rather endemic to most democratic systems. Basically, the overwhelming of trade-based economy and service-based economy, the overwhelming of it with a war economy happens over and over and over. I mean, I don't care what technologies we're talking about. I don't care what range of operations we're talking about, but the phenomena are extraordinarily clear from example to example. So anyway, here, due either to early life imprinting, brainwashing, or for good reasons, I hope, because how can you tell the difference? I think that it's pretty good. It's probably good if we were going to make goods and bads, but it's fraught. And I mean fraught. It is intrinsic that you're going to get fascism via democracy without specific things that routinely and diminish that risk in an extremely dedicated fashion, and doing so in such a way that they're normalized, so that and to be aware that interest groups are going to try to propagandize their way out of that as much as they can, and they won't give up. That's an ongoing thing. You aren't going to hit. There is no steady state economic and socio-political system. That always kind of fascinated me. I wonder, should I blame Hegel for that? The romance of the synthesis? Everyone always seems to forget, and then the new antithesis arrives. But no, there seems to be this fascination with, the synthesis. And it has a little bit to do with folding ecology badly into political discussions. What they call a climax ecosystem, the idea that you have these crappy ones and then another crappy one replaces that, and then that sets the stage for another crappy one to replace that, and then you hit the climax system, usually a boreal forest, I've noticed in the pictures, and then everything, it'll stay that way. That's the good one, the one that, and it's all wrapped up with a bunch of other crap that comes straight from Spencer and from nowhere else. So anyway, the point being that there's this kind of weird belief that there's some magical, way in which the parts will fit, and then society hits its steady state, and whatever happens in it basically sustains that system. Strangely enough, if you're talking to people, they will assume that steady state is going to be, in noun terms, a democracy, which involves tons of things in their heads that has nothing to do with voting. And I mean nothing to do with voting. You don't need voting for a justice system, a non-abusive justice system. You don't need voting for a wide variety of things that are routinely lumped into the word democracy. So, and if you want to claim, well, if we have democracy, it's more likely for those things to happen, I'll say, show me the money. That's sure. Surely not, actually. So anyway, the point I'm driving at here is when your kid asks you about these neat things, pretty interesting to consider whether we're talking about nouns or not. Some other now here's some clickbait for you. Here are a couple of other absurdly, completely non-existent nouns. Totalitarianism, a made-up word which has nothing to do with any actual state. And yeah, everyone's like, Stalin! Oh, shut up. Like you know anything about that. The point here is that one does not have to be supportive, right, of these things to be critical of how they're called. So the issue here is that check and see whether the word is referring to a distinguishable thing, or whether it is better as an adjective, or in some cases, whether it just never existed and only applied as an epithet. So there you go. Clickbait, have fun. Actually in the comments. Good luck with that. Take care.